Sylvie Marchand had worn her good Spanx for this, the ones she'd bought on sale at the Bay 3 months ago and hadn't touched since, still folded in tissue paper like something precious. She'd told herself it wasn't a big deal, just dinner, just a guy she'd been messaging with for 6 weeks who had a nice laugh and remembered she was allergic to shellfish. That wasn't nothing, that was something. She'd taken a half-day off from the accounting firm, gone home to her apartment in Little Portugal, and spent 2 hours getting ready. Her hair was down. She was wearing the burgundy wrap dress that her friend Diane always said made her look like a woman who had her life together. She'd even put on real earrings, the gold ones shaped like tiny crescents, that she'd been saving for a special occasion and never found one. The restaurant was called Auberge Sévérin. It was on King Street West, the kind of place with no menu prices and candles that dripped artistically onto wine bottles. Her date, a man named Brandon, had suggested it. She'd Googled the tasting menu afterward and felt mildly alarmed, but he'd said he was treating, and she'd said okay, and now she was here. She'd arrived at 7:58 for an 8 o'clock reservation. Brandon had said 8, she was sure of it. By 8:15, she'd checked her phone 4 times. By 8:45, she'd checked it 11 times and drunk an entire glass of sparkling water. The server, a young man with careful eyes and a French accent she couldn't quite place, came by twice to ask if she'd like to start with anything. She said she was waiting for someone. He nodded with the particular blankness of a man paid to notice everything and comment on nothing. At 9 o'clock, she texted Brandon.
"Hey, just checking you're on your way?"
The 2 blue check marks appeared. He'd read it. No reply. She set her phone face down on the white linen tablecloth and looked at her reflection in the window beside her. The burgundy dress, the crescent earrings, the carefully dried hair that had taken her 40 minutes and 2 rounds with the diffuser. She thought about how she'd skipped lunch because she'd been too nervous to eat, and how she'd worn the Spanx because she always wore Spanx when she wanted to feel like the best version of herself, and how the best version of herself had now been sitting alone at a table for 2 in one of the most expensive restaurants in Toronto for over an hour. She thought about that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone, opened the app, and deleted Brandon's contact. She didn't block him. Blocking required energy she'd decided he no longer deserved. She just deleted him tidily, the way you clear a desk when a project is over. She reached under the table for her coat and her bag. She was leaving. She was absolutely leaving. She'd go home, take off the Spanx, order from the Thai place on Dundas, and eat it in her pajamas while watching something comforting on Netflix. That was the right choice. That was the dignified choice. She was standing up when the room changed. It wasn't something she could explain precisely. No dramatic sound, no sudden movement. It was more like the pressure shifted the way it does before a storm. The ambient noise of the restaurant. Silver on china, low conversation, soft jazz from somewhere. Didn't stop, but it pulled back, like water before a wave. She turned. The man who had walked in was not someone you looked away from quickly. He was somewhere in his early 40s, tall enough that he had to be aware of every doorframe, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their work seriously. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him specifically, and he walked through the restaurant the way certain people walk through spaces, like the room had been arranged for his convenience. Behind him, 2 men in dark coats moved with the quiet efficiency of people whose job was to be invisible without actually being absent. The maitre was already moving toward him, hands clasped, a smile of the sort usually reserved for names Sylvie had only ever seen on buildings. She was still standing, coat in hand, bag over her shoulder, halfway between sitting and leaving, and for a fraction of a second, the man's gaze swept the room and landed on her. Not past her, on her. She looked away first. Of course she did. She was a 32-year-old accountant from Little Portugal in a wrap dress that she'd bought at Anthropologie during the Boxing Day sale, and he was whatever he was. She started moving toward the exit. She was 3 tables away when one of the men in dark coats stepped very politely directly into her path.
"Miss
Marchand," he said. Not a question. Sylvie stopped. A cold, precise feeling moved through her that had nothing to do with the restaurant's climate control. "I think you have me confused with someone," she said, because her first instinct in any alarming situation was always to be reasonable. "I don't think I do," the man said. "Mr. Voss would like a word, Mr. Voss." She filed that away. The man in the charcoal suit. "I was just leaving," Sylvie said pleasantly. "I understand." The man in the dark coat didn't move. Mr. Voss would still like a word. She looked at him. He looked at her. The restaurant continued its careful performance of normalcy around them. "Is this?" She started. "It would only take a moment," he said. "You're not in any danger. Mr. Voss simply needs to speak with you." Sylvie Marchand was an accountant. She spent her days with numbers, and numbers were honest. They meant exactly what they said, no more and no less. People were harder, but she'd spent enough years working adjacent to men who bent rules for a living to know what certain kinds of politeness were actually saying underneath. This kind was saying, "You're not in danger right now," and whether that stays true is a conversation we'd like to have somewhere quieter. She turned around. Nikolai Voss was already sitting at a table near the back of the restaurant, in a section that had been empty when she arrived. She hadn't seen anyone usher the other diners away. They'd just gone, the way things arranged themselves around certain men without anyone having to ask. She walked to the table. She sat down across from him, because the alternative was standing, and she was not going to stand. He looked at her with grey eyes that were calm in the way that very cold things are calm, not peaceful, just still. "You were leaving?" he said. His voice was low, deliberate, with an accent she couldn't quite identify. Eastern European, maybe. "I was," she confirmed. "I'm still planning to in a moment." He picked up the menu. "Have you eaten?" "Have you eaten?" he said again, the same cadence, entirely without aggression, and somehow that was worse than if he'd raised his voice. "No," she said. "I was stood up." "I know." That landed strangely. "How do you know that?" "I've been watching you sit alone for the past hour," he said. "I noticed when you arrived. I noticed when you checked your phone." He glanced up from the menu. "I noticed when you deleted the contact." The precision of that was unsettling. "You were watching me delete a contact from across a restaurant?" "I was watching your face," he said simply, as if that were a perfectly normal thing to say. "You had a particular expression. I've seen it before." "What expression?" "The one people have when they're deciding not to be embarrassed anymore." He set the menu down. "It's a good expression, I respect it." Sylvie looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want, Mr. Voss?" "To ask you something." He folded his hands on the table. He had large hands, steady, the kind that looked like they'd never shaken. "The man who stood you up tonight, Brandon Keel." Everything in her went very quiet. "What about him?" she said, carefully. "How long have you known him?" 6 weeks, she said. "Online, we'd never actually met." She paused. "Why do you know his name?" "Because Brandon Keel works for me," Nikolai said. "Or he did, until approximately 3 weeks ago, when I discovered that he'd been moving money through a series of accounts that do not belong to him." A pause. "Some of those accounts belong to clients of Marchand and Gray, her firm, the accounting firm where she had worked for 4 years, where she handled the books for 11 small to medium businesses and 3 private investment portfolios, where she was quiet and careful and never drew attention to herself." "You're one of our clients," she said. "Not a question." "My brother is," Nikolai said. "Through a numbered holding company. The details aren't important. What's important is that 3 weeks ago I noticed irregularities. I traced them." He looked at her steadily. "They led to your firm, and specifically to an accountant named Sylvie Marchand. The floor did something strange beneath her feet. Not literally. The floor was marble, imported, entirely stable, but the version of the evening she'd been living inside shifted so completely that she had to consciously sit still and breathe. "You think I was moving the money," she said. "No," he said. "I think you were positioned to take the blame for it." He waited a beat. "There's a difference." She stared at him. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was pressing her thumbs together in the way she always did when she was working through a problem that scared her. "Who set me up? That's what I'd like to know." He reached into his jacket and set a slim folder on the table between them. "The transactions were executed using your login credentials. Your signature appears on 3 documents that authorize transfers. The timeline suggests they were done on evenings and weekends when you weren't in the office." He tapped the folder. "You have a very consistent work schedule, Miss Marchand. You leave at 5:53 on average. You work from the office, not remotely. You never log in on weekends." She looked at the folder and didn't touch it. "You've been investigating me," she said. "I've been investigating the theft," he said. "You came up as the most likely culprit. Then I looked more carefully and concluded you were the most useful scapegoat." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but something adjacent to it. "You're very good at your job, Ms. Marchand. Quietly good. The kind of good that people don't notice until they need someone to blame." She thought about the past few weeks. The small things she'd noticed and filed away and told herself were nothing. A client file that had been accessed and she hadn't remembered opening. A set of authorization codes she'd thought she'd misplaced and then found in a slightly different location in her desk drawer. The general feeling, which she'd dismissed as anxiety, that something at the office was subtly wrong. "Brandon," she said, "he had access to your system through a contractor arrangement we set up 18 months ago," Nikolai said, "before he decided to help himself to things that weren't his." "Did he ask me out specifically?" she said. Was the date?" "I believe it was designed to give him a reason to contact you outside of work," Nikolai said, "to create a paper trail suggesting an inappropriate relationship, to make it easier when the time came, to suggest that the two of you were in it together." He paused. "Tonight was likely when he planned to approach you about it." The standing up was probably a miscalculation. Sylvie sat with that for a moment. 6 weeks of messages. The way he'd remembered the shellfish allergy, the laugh. The way she'd felt when she was getting ready this evening, that maybe this was the time something actually worked out. She'd been built into someone else's fraud scheme and thought she was going on a date. "Say something," Nikolai said. "I'm working through it," she said. He nodded, and to his credit, he was quiet. The server appeared. Nikolai didn't look up from Sylvie. "Bring the tasting menu," he said. "And water, whatever she'd like." "I haven't agreed to anything," Sylvie said, "to no one in particular." "You haven't disagreed either," Nikolai said. She looked at the folder again. "What do you get out of this?" "My brother's money back," he said. "And the name of whoever was running Keel. You think he was working for someone." "Brandon Keel is not intelligent enough to have constructed this alone," Nikolai said, without particular cruelty, just as a statement of fact. "He's a tool. I'm not interested in tools. I'm interested in who picked him up." Sylvie thought about her access logs, about the 3 signatures, about what it would mean if the partners at Marchand and Gray started looking at who'd been using her credentials. She thought about how long it would take them to believe her, and whether they'd bother trying. "I want to see the full transaction record," she said. Something moved through Nikolai's eyes. Not surprise, something quieter. "I can have that for you tomorrow morning," he said. "Tonight," she said. A pause. "Tonight," he agreed. The food arrived. She ate because she was genuinely hungry, and because refusing to eat in front of a man who'd just upended her entire evening felt like a concession she wasn't willing to make. The food was extraordinary. She made a mental note to be irritated about this later, about how the best meal she'd had in years was happening under these particular circumstances. Nikolai ate very little and watched her in the way she was starting to understand was just how he was. Not predatory, exactly, but attentive in the manner of someone who had learned to be cautious with his attention and chose to spend it precisely. "You're not afraid of me," he said at one point. "I'm cautious," she said. "It's different. Most people are afraid." "I know," she said. "I've done books for enough people in your line of work to understand the general shape of things." She looked up. "You're not going to hurt me. I'm more useful to you intact." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "But that's not the only reason." She let that sit there and moved on. There were problems to solve. By 11 o'clock, she had gone through the transaction records on the tablet his assistant brought to the table, and she had found 3 things that no one else had found yet. She was sure of it. Sure because she knew exactly how to hide inside numbers, which meant she knew exactly where to look for something that was hiding. She turned the tablet to face him. "This account," she said, "this numbered one, it's not your brother's." Nikolai looked at it. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not the way faces change in movies, but with the quality of a man revising a calculation. "No," he said slowly. "It's not. The transfers have been staged to look like they originate from Marchand and Gray. But if you look at the timestamp variants," she turned the tablet back, zoomed in on a column of numbers. "The execution lag is 0.3 seconds too long. That's a relay. Someone else's system is in the middle." She looked up. "Whoever your brother's company uses for external IT, that's where I'd start. You found that in 40 minutes still." "I find things in numbers," she said. "It's what I do." She set the tablet down. "It's also what someone tried to use against me." A pause. Around them the restaurant had grown quieter. It was past the dinner rush, and most of the other tables had emptied. The candles had burned lower. "I want a name," she said. "When you find who ran Keel, I want to know why, because they tried to make me into a criminal," she said. "I'd like to know whose idea that was." Nikolai looked at her across the remains of what had been, objectively, a remarkable meal. I'll find out who it was, he said. And when I do, I'll tell you, and then I'll handle it. I can. I'll handle it, he said again, and there was a finality in his voice that wasn't a threat. It was closer to a promise, the kind made by someone who had never broken one, not because he was good, but because his reputation required it. She held his gaze. And my name will be clean, he said. Before the week is out, you have my word. She didn't know what his word was worth. She'd met him 2 hours ago, but she knew enough about numbers to know that a man whose business ran on reputation had particular reasons to keep his promises. Fine, she said. Fine, he said. She stood up to leave. He rose as well, automatically, without ceremony, the reflex of someone raised with a particular idea of how you treated people at a table. Mrs. Marchand, he said. She turned. The man who stood you up tonight, he said, wore the wrong shoes for this restaurant. I noticed when he passed through earlier before you arrived. A pause. You were always going to be the more interesting person at the table. She looked at him. He looked at her. The candlelight did something complicated to the silver in his hair. Good night, Mr. Voss, she said. She walked out through the front door and into the October air, and the city smelled like rain on pavement and streetcar metal, and the particular cold that meant Toronto was remembering it was nearly winter. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. There's a car waiting, Nikolai said. You live in Little Portugal. It's late. She looked down the street. A black car idled at the curb, unhurried, engine barely audible. She thought about saying no. She thought about the Spanx and the skipped lunch and the crescent earrings she'd been saving for a special occasion. And she thought about how the night had started and how it had ended, and how those two things were so far apart she couldn't quite believe they occupied the same calendar date. She got in the car. She wasn't naive. She understood what it meant to accept a ride from Nikolai Voss. She understood the weight of small acceptances, how they accumulated, how they changed the shape of things going forward. She was an accountant. She understood compounding, but she was also a woman who had spent her whole professional life making herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. And in 40 minutes at a restaurant table, reading a set of numbers that everyone else had missed, she had been seen clearly for the first time in years. That wasn't nothing. The car moved through the city. The driver was silent. Outside, Toronto slid past in the way it does late on a weekday. Honest, the scaffolding and the neon and the wet leaves on the gardener. Her phone buzzed again. A message, no name. The IT contractor's name is Aldous Fenwick. He had a meeting with Kiel 6 months ago that doesn't appear on any calendar. I thought you'd want to know tonight. She read it twice. Then she typed back. You work fast. 3 dots. Then I had a head start. I've been looking for 3 weeks. You could have called my firm. I could have. You would have been interviewed by your partners and suspended pending investigation. That seemed like a poor outcome for someone who hadn't done anything wrong. She stared at the screen. Why do you care about my outcome, she typed. A longer pause this time. The car turned onto Dundas. You sat alone for over an hour in a restaurant where you didn't belong, in a dress you wore for someone who didn't deserve it. And when you decided to leave, you deleted the contact before you even stood up. You didn't look angry. You looked like you'd already decided you were worth more than the situation. A pause. That's a rare thing, Miss Marchand. I find I'm inclined to protect rare things. She looked out the window. The Portuguese bakery on her corner had its lights on, still, even this late. The woman inside was stacking pastries in the window case. Normal life, steady and ongoing, indifferent to the particular strangeness of her evening. The car stopped in front of her building. She sat for a moment. Then she typed, My name is Sylvie. She got out of the car. The door closed behind her. The car didn't move until she was inside. She stood in her lobby, burgundy dress and crescent earrings, and the particular exhaustion of an evening that had asked a great deal of her. And she thought about numbers, and about how sometimes the ones you're given don't add up until you change the frame, until you stop trying to solve for what you expected and start solving for what's actually there. Her phone lit up one more time. Good night, Sylvie. She went upstairs. She took off the Spanx. She didn't order Thai. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her own copies of the Marchand and Gray access logs, and she started building something that would leave no room for doubt, a clear, documented, time-stamped record of every irregularity, every relay signature, every borrowed credential, assembled with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. By the time she was done, it was past 2 in the morning, and the file was clean and complete and irrefutable. She was an accountant. This was what she did. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, She understood that being quietly good at something was not the same as being invisible, and that the right person, paying the right kind of attention, would always be able to tell the difference.